Today I'm taking a Servida sample. I'm gonna make my own beat out of it. Alright, so in Simon's 300K kit, he has a bunch of sample loops here. I'm going to use this loop here. I like the way the texture sound in this loop, and compared to the other samples, there isn't as much instruments playing in this one, so it's going to be a little bit easier to sample. But one of the things that might make it a little bit more difficult to sample is it just has a lot of movement melodically. One of the things that I like to do in this situation where I want to get a little bit more experimental is use the Fruity Granulizer. This is a stock plugin that comes with FL Studio, and it can create a pretty unique effect with our sample. All you gotta do is take your sample and drag it into this area right here. And you're just gonna start playing with the dials and you guys can hear what's gonna happen. Basically what it's doing is taking our sample and splitting it up into micro chops. And we can control those micro chops and the space in between them using all these dials here. I did a video a while back on how to use this plugin a little bit more in depth, so check that out if you're interested. So with this setting here, I sort of like the way the sample's starting to sound. So what I'm going to do is just play this as one long note, and then I'm going to render it as audio. Now the sample is going to be a little bit easier to control if I take this loop here and I chop this up. Alright, I chopped up my sample here. I tried my best to make sure that every single chop here is a different note. This is going to make it easier to come up with a progression. I also pitched the sample up quite a bit just because the sample registered in too low of a frequency range for my liking. So now I'm going to go ahead and come up with a progression here. So this sounds like a pretty cool progression to me. You guys can see I went a pretty long way just to create my own loop out of the original sample here. So these sound nothing alike, but I think this is a pretty good way to show that sampling doesn't just mean to take a loop and throw your drums on. You can get really experimental and out there with your technique. Now I'm going to go ahead and make this sound a little bit more interesting by adding some effects on top. Right now with this crazy stuttering effect, I really like it, but nonetheless it might sound a little bit too unnatural. A lot of the times you might hear people talk about overcompression and how if you compress your sounds way too much, it'll end up sounding really unnatural because you'll ruin the dynamics of your sound. Well, I sort of have a similar problem here, but for the opposite reason. Right now this loop sounds a little bit too unnatural just because the stuttering effect has the dynamics sounding way too extreme, just for my tastes. So what I'm going to do is add some delay on top of the sound here. I'm also going to add some saturation here, and I'm also going to add some multi-band compression. These effects help me take my sound and sort of just even out the dynamics of it. Next up, I'm going to take a stereo shaper and make the sample a little bit more narrow in the stereo field. It's sounding a little bit too out of control for me. I'm also going to take an EQ and remove some of the frequencies that I don't need, like the low end here, and boost some of the ones that I do need, like the mid-range. You guys will notice I also have these small little cuts here just because some of the frequencies were a little bit too harsh for me. You guys can hear how these sounds if I boost them up. You get that sort of resonant tone which I didn't really like. Alright, so this main loop is sounding good to me. What I'm going to do now is add my drums on top. As some of you guys know, if you watched my channel before, typically I like to add a kick on the 1 and a snare on the 2 and the 4, just because that's the fundamental of any hip hop pattern, so it's a good place to start. Since the BPM of this beat is pretty low, this gives me a lot of room to be a little bit more dense with my drum pattern, so I'm going to get pretty expressive with my kicks here. I think to make this slightly more interesting, what I'm going to do is take another kick here, and I'm going to take some of the notes from my original kick pattern here and paste it into my secondary kick, just to add a little bit more variation into the beat. With the snare, I'm not going to complicate the pattern too much, I don't think, but as the snare sounds right now, it doesn't really feel all that dense in the beat. So sometimes what I like to do is play the snare at multiple pitches, see how that sounds. Next up is the hi-hat pattern. I don't want to get too complicated with this pattern right now though. And now for the 808 pattern, I sort of like the idea of keeping this beat a little bit more minimal and sort of spacey, so I'm not going to get too complicated with the 808 pattern. Now at this point, I'm going to try and use some of the other samples in Simon's pack to add some more textures into the beat. And this is why I wanted to keep the hi-hat pattern and the 808 pattern a little bit more minimal, just to make sure I have enough room in the beat for some of these other textures. I'm not going to bother chopping these up, I'm going to add them straight into the beat here. And I'm just going to comb through to see if I can find something that I like. I think maybe I can use a sample to create a short little riff in the beat. So I just isolated that one note in the sample and just played it like an actual instrument on top of the beat. The notes that I played works with the beat, but the sound itself doesn't sound all that great in the actual beat. So I'm going to get pretty experimental and try to push the sound so it actually sounds good with some mixing tools. Alright, so now that sounds cool to me. What I did is I took an EQ, constricted the frequencies of the actual sound, added some replica on top, which is a delay effect, just so it's a little bit more spacey. Same thing with the reverb here, just so it's a little bit more spacey in the beat. I added a rhythmizer on top, so when it plays, it has a cool gating effect. After that, I used auto pitch, which harmonized the sound. So after all of that, it sounds a lot better now. Let's try to add another sound from Simon's pack now. Alright, so after some pretty heavy experimentation, I ended up using this sample here. And I used it to create this layer in the beat here. And when it's playing with the rest of the beat, again, what I did with this sound was I took an EQ, constricted the frequencies again, harmonized the sound with auto pitch, and just threw it back into the beat with some reverb and some delay. Again, going in, I knew the sound wasn't going to be a huge focal point in the beat. It was just going to be more so of a small little layer, a little texture in the beat that I was going to add. And so that's why I constricted the frequency with an EQ here, just because if I didn't, it just takes up a lot of room in terms of its frequency, so I just really drastically cut it. And so now it's going to be a little bit more easy to take this sound and have it fit in the beat and not be in conflict with any of the others. At this point, the beat still does sound a little bit too thin, so I'm going to do my best to add some more additional layers on top, a little bit of percussion, some smaller noises like that. Alright, so first I added these percussion layers into the beat. I also layered this sound on top of the kick just so it sounds a little bit more pronounced in the beat. So this is how the kick would sound without this. And once I add this on, there's a little bit of color on top of the kick, so it's going to cut through the mix a tiny bit more. I also added this little riff with a synth in the beat. And then I added a bunch of additional hi-hats and these open hats, but really with the main part of the beat, this is going to sound a little bit too thick. So I might just use these specifically for the hook section of the beat. Speaking of which, it might be a time to arrange this beat out now. So let's say, for example, like I mentioned, I get rid of these hats. And I just have these layers playing for the verse section. And then once we get to the hook, the additional hi-hats just pick up the energy a tiny bit. But even as it is, I don't really feel satisfied with just taking the hook and adding some additional hi-hats on top. I'm gonna do something a little bit more special. So I took these vocals from Simon's from another video that he made.
Never satisfied, never.
I'm just gonna layer that on top of my beat here in the second portion of the hook.
Never satisfied, never satisfied, never satisfied, never.
After the hook, instead of going directly back into the verse section, I sort of want to create a bridge here. To help the bridge actually fit with the beat, I'm going to keep some of the textures the same. Some of them I'm going to make a little bit different. So I'm going to go ahead and remove most of these sounds here. So I think a cool idea would be to take my main loop here. I'm going to make it unique. I'm going to render the audio out. And I'm going to play the exact same loop here. Except I'm going to pitch it down 12 semitones. Also, to create some more variation, instead of using an 808 for the bridge, I'm going to go ahead and use a sub bass instead. Alright, this is sounding pretty good to me. Now what I'm going to do is focus in on the transitions in between each of the sections, as well as creating an intro and an outro. I think a cool idea to get from the bridge out into the verse section is to take the original loop and introduce it back a little bit early, and also drop the rest of the sounds for the very end section there. To get from the verse section into the hook section, I think a good idea would be to introduce the vocal sample a little bit early as well. And also use this throughout the entire hook might be a good idea as well. I'll also drop some of the other textures here. To make the transition a little bit more smooth, I also added this drum fill here. I'm also going to add this sweep and this crash to make it a little bit more smooth as well. As well, the usual switch ups and random patterns throughout the beat. If you guys have watched my video on the 3 ways you can keep your beat interesting, this is one of the things that I outlined in that video. Now I'm going to make the intro. I think what I'm going to do is take some of the elements from my beat and just have an alternate pattern playing for them. So for the main loop here, I'm going to try to find another progression that I can use. I'll also do the exact same thing with this 808 pattern, make something unique and different in the intro here. And I also took the vocals from the other section that I showed you guys and made an entirely different pattern for the intro here. Also, I think a cool idea would be to take the 808. I'm going to use an EQ and cut out a lot of the low end. And I'm going to automate this effect. I think that'd be a cool idea. So now let's hear how this sounds.
Where I sleep, painful mentally, it's getting one dark, way too much, never satisfied.
And for the outro, I'm just going to keep it pretty simple. I'm just going to let that vocal sample play the beat out and just drop most of the other instruments here.
Never satisfied. Never.
And there you guys have it. I took the sample from Servida's 300K kit and I made my own beat out of it. If you guys have enjoyed this video, let me know in the comment section below. Let me know which producer you'd like to see me do this series on next. My free drum kit is available in the description box below. Also, the link to the Discord is down there as well if you guys want to join in the live beat review. And I'll see you guys next time.